In this episode, I have a conversation with Reverend Cynthia Brooks and Dr. William Keepan, founders of Gender Equity and Reconciliation International and lead authors of a new book, Gender Equity and Reconciliation 30 Years of Healing the Most Ancient Wound in the Human Family. This is one of my favorite topics, the dreaded and stubborn patriarchal wound that wreaks havoc within the psyches of men and women. Even those who have successfully detached from the conventional and limiting labels of gender and sexual orientation, meaning they're a little more conscious about these perceived opposing energies of masculine and feminine inside us, they too suffer. In the description box, I'm going to share two links to blog posts I wrote after doing workshops for Alverno University's annual community conference. I hadn't even submitted my final dissertation at the time about exploring women's experience of reconciling sexuality and spirituality through the lens of the Jungian theory of individuation, but new ways to discuss this old generational wound were bursting out of me. During the workshops, I could see that younger people, men, women, and those who would consider themselves non-binary were able to recognize that men as well as women carry a patriarchal wound. We all do, although men's suffering plays out in different ways. It was a beautiful experience of people being able to honor their version of the patriarchal wound without dismissing the suffering of men and others who carry their own version. So, men are not the enemy, which happens to be the title of one of the blog posts. We all have both a wounded feminine and a wounded masculine. The patriarchal wound is simply the one sided valuing of the masculine style of consciousness over the feminine and the projection of the degrading of the feminine style of consciousness onto literal women, their bodies, their sexuality, and nature, as well as onto literal men who don't conform to the one sided notion of the masculine. So, how did this conversation come about? It's really a perfect example of synchronicity. An email showed up in my inbox asking if I'd like to help promote the new book, Gender Equity and Reconciliation. All I had to know was that it was endorsed by Rian Eisler, systems scientist and author of Chalice and the Blade and Sacred Pleasure. I was in. So let me tell you a little bit more about my guests for this episode. Cynthia is an ordained interfaith minister with a background in women's issues and racial diversity. She co-organized 7 international conferences on interspirituality, including 2 on women's spiritual leadership across diverse religious and indigenous traditions. William is a mathematical physicist with training in contemplative spirituality and transpersonal psychology. His research on global warming and sustainable energy influenced international environmental policy. Cynthia and William are joined by 16 other authors in this new book, which offers such a wide range of thoughts on various aspects of this complex gender wound. So let's get started. Welcome, Cynthia and Will.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thanks, Deborah. Wonderful to be here.
Yeah. So, oh my gosh, I was so excited to meet you guys and learn about your book. So, why don't we just start with how are you? What's up with your lives these days? So, not only are you promoting this amazing book, but you also run an international organization. So, why don't you, just give us a little bit about what's going on in your life, and then we'll move to how did this book come about? So, wherever you want to start.
We'll start with, we have an organization called the Satyan Institute, and we have 2 program areas. One is the Gender Equity and Reconciliation International, which we fondly call GERI as the acronym. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Our other program is called Dawn of Interspirituality, and it's bringing people together of different faith traditions and spiritual but not religious people to be friends, to, talk about deepening into our practice, not just talk, but about coming into that contemplative space together to become friends and have better relationships. So both our programs are very similar in a way of creating safe forms for us to deepen into conversation compassion and deeper understanding. Yeah.
I love it. Oh, the world needs a lot of that
The
these
world
days.
needs to, the human family needs to become more united than we are. And
Yeah.
all of our work works with bridging these artificial divisions that the mind has made, whether
Yes.
it's religion and science, or gender. So that's kind of the overarching theme of our work. And in terms of what we're up to right now, our Jerry, Gender Equity and Reconciliation International Program, is now actively engaged in, because we've been doing this work for 31 years, as we'll speak about as we go into it. So we are actively engaged in training the next generation of leaders. And so we are running 3 international trainings right now and starting a 4th one next week. So we have a training that started in India about a month ago, one in Kenya that started a week ago, one in Latin America that started about 6 weeks ago, and one in the North America in Chicago that starts next week.
Wow.
Each one of these is a year-long training. One of them is an online training, but the other 3 are year-long trainings. So they meet for basically 6-day modules 4 times over the year. And then after that, the trainees go into an internship program. And what they're learning is 2 things. One is basically doing the whole transformative alchemy of their own relationship to all of these issues of gender oppression and sexuality and social and cultural conditioning and personal experience. And then also working with our model of how to facilitate others in that same process, how to facilitate groups in what we call the collective alchemy of gender reconciliation and transformation.
And that the piece around gender is, how do I, as a woman, identified as a woman, relate to myself, relate to men, relate to other women, relate to anyone of a different gender? So it's across the spectrum, gender identity and expression. And it's really creating that safe space that we can come into, because a lot of people don't feel real safe out there to speak about their experiences. And yet once we do come into a conversation and a deeper process, then we find out that while our experiences might be different, so many of them are universal. And I also want to just note that as a white woman from North America, from Seattle area, my experience may be very similar to an African-American woman in the States, but it's also different. And so we also speak about the intersectionalities of race, age, culture, religion, ability, all of these things. So all of it comes in the mix.
I love it. I love that you brought up alchemy. It's just something I touched on in my education. It's such a huge field, like just by itself. But what it makes me, your training, what it makes me think about is when I learned that the root of knowing or to know is to relate, which means that if we only understand something of the mind, it's incomplete knowing. And so part of your training being that it's an embodied experience of the training, not this intellectual understanding of the concepts. And then, you know, their experience of experiencing the training. I'm an introverted intuitive, so I'm always aware of like, what is my experience of the experience? Then I assume just makes them more effective in being able to hold space for other people. So I love it. And I love you brought up archetypes. So yeah, we're part of a universal family, but the archetypes, I know it was in one of my questions at some point, so maybe we can just talk about it now, that the archetypes cannot be known except when they're expressed through individual human experiences, and our human experiences are, you know, limited by our point in time and the timeline of history and culture and geography. And so I love that you touched on that too. So maybe you can now talk about how did that end up being this book?
Yeah, well, we've been doing this work for 31 years, and it's grown from where it began in the environmental movement and evolved over the years. And this particular book came because when COVID happened, we had been meaning to do a second edition of a book we did back in 2007, and we just never had time and never got around to it. And meanwhile, the work grew 12-fold since
Oh
then.
my gosh.
I know. So we were overdue for a documentation of the work and updating it, but we were so full with the work, we never got around to it. But with COVID, that shifted things, of course, because we had to shift everything to online.
Mhm.
And that meant we were home more. And it also took a while to get that going. And so we thought, this is an ideal time. Let's do this book. It's time. And so we basically put out a call to all of our leaders around the world, because we've been training people to do this work since 2001. So we had more than 20 years of trainees out there who've also been implementing the work in their various countries and contexts. So we put out the word to gather the stories. What
Mhm.
are what are your stories? What are your learnings? What are your lessons? What are your anecdotes? What is your data? And we basically gathered all that material and went through it and edited and compiled it and put it together into this book. And that's the reason the book has 20 co-authors. That was a hard sell with our publisher, because publishers don't tend to like that. It's not an anthology. It's a book in which each of these authors, co-authors, has contributed a major part of the work that could not have happened without them.
Mm.
We, as two white heterosexual couple from the US, can't know how to work in these different populations in which we're working. So our strategy has always been to only go where we're invited, and then to go in sensitively and work with the leaders who invited us and train them so that they can then carry the work to their constituency.
Mhm.
That's been our model for taking this work into the various countries. We've introduced it now in about 14 countries. And it's been very inspiring to see how the work takes root in these vastly different cultures. And yet the essence of the work is the same. That's the essence of the work is that the heart can cross these gulfs and these chasms that we have created in our societies, particularly around gender.
Well,
Gender
that's
expression.
that's
Yeah.
beautiful. And it's so Jungian because that requires the capacity to hold something that is perceived to be in opposition, right?
Yes.
Because, white people are known for thinking that they know it all and they have to
Yep.
control it. And so even though like you are the founders of this effort, this movement, there is this recognition that you have to let go of what happens, but then it ends up circling back to accomplish, right? What you're trying to set out to accomplish, but you can't accomplish that without this. So,
It's so true. And
yeah.
if I can just give one quick
Yeah.
example. We were in Kenya this was our first workshop in Kenya back in 2010. And I was supposed to have a co-facilitator from Kenya. He got sick at the last minute. So it's me, some white guy from Seattle, and a whole group of Black African men. Well, guess what? They just decided to speak Swahili. And all the instructions I gave them, they just blew me off. And they all spoke decent enough English.
Right.
But why speak English, and they just were thwarting the whole process. And so then we went to the facilitator meetings and say, the organizer's not working and the men aren't.
We don't need to do this.
And we thought, if they don't want to do the work. But what we ended up giving them was a role play exercise, which they could keep talking in Swahili, but it gave them some direction to work with the gender issues in their culture. And that was done with the women. And then the whole thing just heated up with all of the issues. And after that, they were fully engaged in the work.
It's a beautiful workshop. Yeah.
That is beautiful because, and not all white men would be able to take that, right? Your ego, you're like, but okay, this makes total sense though. What happened, right? So then you're like, oh, all right,
totally.
Well, how do we adapt and how do we, create space to come together? And even the way you described it was very alchemy. I love it.
Alchemy, you keep mentioning it. I just want to say alchemy is really at the core of this work. And in fact, we have a term that I haven't heard elsewhere, but I'm sure it exists in some sense, but we call it collective alchemy, because alchemy traditionally refers to that psycho-spiritual transmutation of our own unconscious and our own shadow into spiritual awakening. And you have the stages of the nigredo and the albedo and the rubedo, the shadow, and then the finding of the light in the darkness, and then the emergence of new life and harvesting the gold and all of that. We do that in groups.
Mm-hmm.
So we're essentially, as a group of human beings of different gender identities, men, women, and people of all different genders. We do have, by the way, 3 program areas. One is for people who identify primarily as men and women. Another one is for people who identify as LGBTQ plus. And then we have a third one for BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color.
Oh, okay.
And we also mix these together sometimes. Each of these groups also needs to do its own work on its own,
Right.
in order to delve into their own issues. But
Right.
anyway, back to collective alchemy, we come together, we go deliberately into the difficult material, the challenging, the shadow, the places of wounding, and it's not easy. So we have a different
Right.
set of practices for doing that, but we go into those difficult places. And what we find when we do that with integrity and compassionate awareness and presence is that we move through the pain and the challenge, and we are able to come and transmute those challenging issues and come into an experience of the alchemical gold, of harvesting essentially an experience of beloved community together as the veils drop away and we all see one another soul to soul, and we reestablish that fundamental archetypal unity.
You know what image is coming up for me is the scene in Avatar, which I didn't like for the reason that, the writers had intended. I really was all about the relationship between the two people from different backgrounds. But that moment where they mutually see each other and they actually say, I see you. I see you. And I'm like, there it is. That's what you described. And for my for my listeners and viewers, I have not done any podcasts on alchemy. And this is not a podcast about alchemy, but how I have spoken about it is using Carl Jung's individuation theory. So alchemy is basically, his individuation theory really was informed by all of that digging into alchemy and that process. And so the stages really are the same. But I have also, with my my listeners and viewers have heard me say that individuation, yes, happens on a personal level, but it also happens for a relationship. Right. So just like alchemy collectively in a relationship, there's an individuation process going on, and collectively, of course, within a business, even within a family, within a community, within the world. So, so I really appreciate that. And even when I talk about the feminine masculine a lot, and I talk about coming of age in the 80s, but when Thelma and Louise came out, it was representing this unleashing from the collective unconscious. So all these individual women's experiences and all of the anger and all of that, like ushered in, is responsible really for leading to the Violence Against Women Act and for criminalizing marital rape and all of that sort of stuff. So, we can call it alchemy or individuation on a collective level, but the point is that in the end, we are both individual, unique expressions of the divine, but we're also can't be separated from the collective human family at the same time. So those are
very true.
Those are those opposing forces that, that you create space to be able to, that's safe to be able to experience. So I feel like maybe we have to go back a little bit and even talk about like what you mean by, the gender wound. My first question, or my next question, really has to do with just helping people relate to it, the concept of a gender wound. And one of the things that's also coming up for me is before I was even done with my dissertation, which was exploring women's experience of reconciling sexuality and spirituality through Carl Jung's lens of theory of individuation. I did a workshop because one of the things that I've always been able to hold is not only my own wound, my own patriarchal wound, but at the same time, I had this empathy for men. For like, I was like, women, we're fighting, man, and we're gaining and we're like being obnoxious and we feel like empowered to do it. And men are like, what's going on? The rug is like, what? Like, what does it mean to be a man? And then who do they look for, so they, I think there's been inadequate frameworks for men to be able to also adapt. So, so men have this patriarchal wound that has to do with what does it mean to be a man, and women carry another form of patriarchal wound. But I've always been really uncomfortable with the projecting onto literal men that it's their responsibility, that it's their fault that we have this patriarchy and this, these entrenched systems of one-sided valuing of the masculine, which now we call toxic masculinity, which gets confused with masculinity. So, I wonder how you want to just talk about how you talk about the gender wound.
Well, I'll start with my own story. How's that? And I grew up in the 60s and had a mother very involved with the women's rights movement in the States during that time. And so I loved men and wanted to be in relationship with men. And I was. However, when I turned right around the time I was 39, 40 years old, after I had completed my master's degrees and everything and had made it, I landed a corporate job and had been studying about the man who co-founded this organization, a wellness or health and wellness organization. I was middle management. And within a few months of working there, he sexually propositioned me. He's world renowned. And I decided to bring it forward in the most compassionate way I could. It was over a business dinner when he propositioned me. He said, "Cynthia, I've enjoyed getting to know you. Now it's time to take our relationship to a deeper, more intimate sexual level." And it was just an expectation. This is the next move. If that had been a romantic relationship, I might have said yes, but it wasn't. He had power over me. I was his employee. And I wasn't interested. And so he continued to pressure me. I decided to bring it forward in the organization. I got pushed out of that organization. And when I was pushed out, lost my job, I didn't trust men. I didn't like men. I didn't know how to be in my body. But I also didn't trust women because they betrayed me too. They had to keep their jobs. And it took a lot of self-reflection, a lot of healing, a lot of therapy, time away, and a rebuilding of trust. And I bring that story up because a lot of people, a good proportion of women have been through similar experiences in their job. Some men have been too in that particular situation. And were pushed kind of literally into a corner to make a decision. And then we are told to go on with life and get over it, go get another job. But where do we actually get to speak about it? The Me Too movement gave voice to that. Many of those women courageously came forward and spoke truth in a public forum. And I honor that. And it was so necessary. What was missing for me were the men's voices there too. Because as you're saying, Deborah, men also go through, and boys and men go through pain and suffering around the patriarchal system. Boys at a young age are trained to man up, to don't cry, toughen up. The bully system, all of that is all entrenched in there. And so to even recognize that we're part of a system that is shaping and forming us throughout our life can be, when we realize it, if we get that opportunity, like in one of our programs, we realize, wow, I didn't even realize that I had this wounding in my life or this mistrust of others, whoever the other is. And so what in my own experience, it did take a lot of healing that I needed. And I actually came into a place of deeper understanding, and I was able to turn the betrayal and my anger into a deeper understanding, deeper compassion, and
Mhm.
ultimately a higher reverence for men in my life.
Mhm.
And I really honor and respect the men who are consciously working in these ways. I remember that oftentimes, I don't remember, I know that oftentimes I hear women say to me, I love my women's group, but I just don't trust men enough to be in a group with them. And the same
Mm.
is true. Men saying, I don't trust. And I hear a lot of younger men in particular, but men of all ages saying, I don't know how to be a man anymore. I
Yeah.
don't know how to show up in relationships, so they isolate or they don't speak because they're fearful of stepping on toes. So
Well,
that's just one example from
well,
my
and
own.
and you know what? I really appreciate that. I have so many thoughts that are coming up for me, and one in particular is Brene Brown, when she tells the story of, she had been doing this research and it mainly focused on women, I guess, assuming that, women have these problems with vulnerability more than men. But men started coming up to her and being like, what about us? What about
Yeah.
our vulnerability? And one of the things that I share is that, she says, women say they want men to show vulnerability, but when they do, they're almost sickened by it. And you
Mm.
know what? That's true. And women have to really own that they say they want something from men, but when men show it, all of a sudden, they see those men as weak. So this will be for another podcast, or I had a chat with my son, actually, he's 22, but young men, I really worry about who is there, what they're susceptible to because of feeling sort of rejected. The other thing though that comes up for me, and I know this happens in your sessions and your training, but it's so beautiful to see it, that when I was speaking at community conferences at Alverno in Milwaukee, that it was kind of a new aha for women who are feisty, and they're like, they know their gender wound. And I they were able, though, by the end of the workshop, to be able to like honor their wound and also not dismiss men's wound, because
Mm.
it's different. It just manifests in a different way, right? So women experiences it as being, limiting and belittling and that sort of thing, but men experience it as like never feeling like they're good enough, because patriarchy relies on hierarchy and ranking, and you always have to compare, and in order to be on top, somebody's got to be a bottom and that sort of thing. Um, so great. I love it. Will, what do you
Yeah,
want
I
to?
just want to add a couple of things here. First of all, I really appreciate that you recognize that men are also afflicted, because one of the patterns we've noticed in our work, and it's very understandable, is that women often assume that we have all the problems, men are fine because they have all the privileges, and so they're doing fine, but we women are suffering. And what we hear all the time from women in our work is they had no idea how much men suffer in
Yeah.
this system. They had no understanding of what, like Bell Hooks talks about when she says that men and boys have to self-mutilate part of their humanity in order to fit into the male socialization man box.
Right.
And if they don't do it to themselves, their peers do it to them.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So men are profoundly betrayed in this system, as well as women, in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And what emerges in our work, and then what we hear from men all the time in our work, is I knew that women had, issues. I had no idea what it's actually like to walk through the world as a woman. I had no clue.
Right.
So,
To feel like fear in a way that
yeah,
men don't. Right. Yeah.
that's right.
That's
That's
beautiful.
right.
I love it.
And to become sensitized to that. So what happens is that both men and women are suffering in ways that the other doesn't fully get.
Yes. Yes.
And that's the essence of what happens in our work, is we get
Mm.
to a new level of very deep, painful, but deep truth telling. And the beauty of that truth is like oxygen. And it's worth the pain to get there, because then we come to a ground of reality with one another.
Mm.
And
Well,
that is so crucial.
Well, that's the transcendent third that Carl Jung talks about,
Yes,
right? Right?
exactly.
And it's through reconciliation. And the other thing that is coming up to me is I had a podcast interview. He's my friend, but Dr. Sean Miller, his expertise is looking at sexuality through a philosophical lens. But one of the things he enlightened me about is that men tend to underestimate their peers' desire for equality. So, meaning if there's a group of men standing around and there are what I call quality men, like quality men are like, yeah, I'm imperfect and I get women are suffering and I'm suffering too. They're just kind of more like, they're not so defensive about it, and they support women, they're allies of women, but they will assume that most of the men that they're around are not as enlightened as they are. And so what they end up doing actually is suppressing the enlightenment of those men in the group. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah,
Mm,
I was like,
sure.
what? What? Like, so even without those men saying anything sexist, that man is assuming they're more sexist than they are.
Mhm.
mm,
And so therefore there is like this repression of really their enlightenment that
Yeah.
is not
mhm.
allowed to, and I like the word oxygen, that is not even getting any oxygen. If they only knew they were all less sexist than they think they are.
Yeah.
Can you imagine? So
Yeah, and that's well put, and I think that's what also happens in our work. I know that one thing that we have found and realized over the years, and what happens to men in our work, is that they realize that the greatest male privilege is not any of the advantages that are afforded to men, in essentially a patriarchal society, but the greatest male privilege is actually to participate in the deconstruction of that whole system itself and collaborate actively with women and with people of all gender identities to live in a culture of equality and mutual respect, and then eventually mutual reverence emerges. That's the
this,
greatest privilege.
yeah, this is sort of circling back to what I was meaning to say, which is that today patriarchy isn't about men and women. It's just one way that this warped, one sided valuing of the masculine style of consciousness has played out. Capitalism, that's a manifestation of this imbalance, right? And capitalism affects all of us. It's not about men and women. It's just this
Right.
valuing of profit over human lives. So, which also then impacts our environment, or which impacts human lives. So, if we can help, that's what I'm trying to sort of do with my movement, is to help people understand that it's not about literal men and women. It's right. It's about the masculine and feminine. So even within groups of men, there are men and then there are like not men, right? So it doesn't even have to do with gender. It has to do with these systems of inequality and that thrive on ranking, and also just enforcing that ranking in awful ways, including through economics.
Yeah,
It's true.
very true.
I'd like to interject here and
Mhm.
just say the importance of first of all, with the alchemy, that our work is focused on gender, but there's a spiritual foundation
Mm,
to our work, regardless of what anyone believes or thinks. And if you're an atheist or an agnostic, then it's about the highest human potential.
mhm.
If you have a spiritual tradition or practice, then we really uh, bring that into our work, whether it's just focusing on a breath, or if it's actual other, mantra practice or repetition of the holy name, whatever your tradition is, because it's so essential. This work is about the gender piece and the gender wound, but how are we held? What's holding us as a collective
Mhm.
to move through these issues, to come out the other side? And when we go into the wound, when we go into our stories, which vary vastly, they're everyone has some story to share, basically, around what it's like to be the gender they are.
Mhm.
After that, it's so important, our work, not to stay there and wallow in the pain forever, but rather to lift ourselves up and to acknowledge and honor what we've been through together. So in the Me Too to We Together program that we have, the men create a ceremony to honor the women in the workshop and the feminine. And the women create a ceremony to honor the men and the masculine. And these are just profound. They're just so beautiful. And it really brings together the depth of the work that's been done into a higher level of that reverence that you were speaking to, Will. And it doesn't mean we've healed all the wounds of thousands of years, but we've begun. And it's really important to consecrate the work. And oftentimes in our activism, or however you coin it, or I mean, not coin it, but call it, as terms of how we want to change the world, we're out there doing the good fight, or we're trying to make relationships work, but we don't slow down enough for the ceremony of honoring one another, for all the ways we show up. And that's just such an essential part of our work.
I love it. It feels so, it really is a sacred experience. And I wonder, and I like this idea of like men celebrating the feminine in women, but from a depth psychology perspective, those women are now mirroring back their inner feminine, because of course, to not honor the feminine in women means you're really not aware of your own feminine. And I love depth psychology because it's a spiritual practice. So it doesn't rely on any sort of doctrine or dogma, but the coming into deeper relationship with yourself, capital S, this part of you that knows more about you than you know, really is the bridge to the divine, or to nature, or to the quantum realm, or however you want to call it. So I love it. It's beautiful. So let's see what else I have here. I'm really curious about how you've intertwined this with the environment. So I'm really, first of all, I'm fascinated by both of your very distinct backgrounds, and the spiritual and gender, and then your environmental work. And of course, the environment, nature, is the feminine, right? And so just like women and their bodies and sexuality has been denigrated and subordinated, it's manifested in a way towards degrading the environment as well. And so coming into relationship and valuing the environment is a way of coming into deeper relationship with our feminine individually and as a collective. So whatever you want to say about that.
Well, that's beautiful what you've just said. It's where the work started, because as you mentioned, my background was as an environmental activist, environmental scientist. I worked in policies and technologies for abating global warming, particularly working with sustainable and renewable energy technologies. I worked in that field for 25 years. And this work got started 31 years ago in the environmental movement because of essentially Me Too type violations that were taking place within our professional networks. So, which were creating a lot of pain and were taboo to talk about. And it was a particularly striking contradiction, because here we were trying to heal our relationship with the natural ecology, but we had this kind of toxic crisis in our human ecology within the professional networks. So we began by convening these events, and we called them initially Gender and Ecology. And the byline was, are there parallels between exploitation of the earth and exploitation of the feminine? And that was the subtitle to the program. Of course, there are, as you just pointed out, profound ones. And then, so that's where the work got started. And what you're saying is so important, because really that is systemic. There is a profound connection between our connections across the gender divide and our connections to the earth and to the heavens, if you will, and to the archetypes. And so by reconnecting horizontally, we reconnect vertically as well. We reconnect to the earth. And that has been such a profound aspect of our work. And it awakens. I have a strong conviction that if we could heal this gender issue in the human family, it would contribute massively towards healing our relationship with the earth. because it reawakens our joy in life itself, in the magic and the enchantment of it, in the delight, the reverence, the sexuality. All of these things are awakened in that healing and become re-enchanted and reinvigorated.
Oh my
It's
gosh.
something that we
Okay.
like to say. Sometimes we say that, this system of gender injustice, it goes by the name of patriarchy sometimes, but it really would be better called androcentric,
Oh, okay.
because androcentric means it has a masculine bias, but it doesn't blame the men necessarily.
Mm.
And we really move from an androcentric kind of collective to an androgynous collective, because as Jung pointed out, the male has both animus and anima with it, and so does the female. So we actually unite these different levels. And one way that we've put it in our work is that patriarchy is thousands of years old, but it's only a few days deep.
Oh,
Because in a few days of deep truth telling, we actually get to the place where we all can see that we have been mutually betrayed by the system. And then the shackles just crumble, they fall away, and then we see each other, as you were saying earlier, as we were saying,
oh my.
soul to soul. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I mean, yeah, right now there's so much distraction on purpose, right? People in power just distracting with this. But I do feel like there's a climaxing going on right now. And of course, with alchemy, there has to be like the fiery, before something happens.
So
And so I can see like the climaxing of the hatred, the stagnant belief systems, and that's where most of people's attention is. But I am part of the work that I do with clients and helping them come into deeper relationship with their self. I'll say to them and they'll just look at me like, wow, I'm that important. I'm like, you have no idea that you're healing as you come into deeper relationship with yourself, that once you deal with your personal complexes, that the doorway to the archetypes opens and they want to come in and use you as a vessel to help the
So true.
archetypes unleash in a new form. And the collective
So
is
true.
just begging for something to be unleashed from the collective unconscious. So I also have this image, you won't be surprised, the tree that came up. It's such a beautiful image for the reconciliation, the connection between, heaven and earth, spirit and nature and body and feminine and all of that. And also what's coming up for me is, I don't know if you are familiar with Robin Robinson's book. It's called Beginner's Guide to Revelation. So he analyzes the book of Revelation through a depth psychology lens, and it becomes so like, well, of course that's what it is. This is a spiritual thing that's happening, that's about reconciling the ultimate opposites of the feminine, the masculine, heaven and earth, the intellect and the body, and all of that. And so right after I read that book, it was living in me. And I went to see Aquaman 8 times. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. This is the book of Revelation, is Aquaman right now. So I also I
wow,
love Jungian film theory. And I was like, I can see how this is working its way into consciousness through film and all sorts of things. So
that's beautiful. Yeah, that's great. Aquaman 8 times.
mhm.
Woo.
Oh yeah, you'll be amazed at what I got out of Alita Battle Angel and what I think that's all about. But so I love it. I love it because my listeners are used to me throwing out some depth psychology concepts, and they're really like, they're a bridge between this work that you're doing that feels really big, I think, to people, but it's also relatable, especially through your stories. So
Now, Deborah, before you move to another
yeah.
question, I just want to say to your listeners, one thing that will enliven a dinner conversation is one of the questions we ask in our workshops is, what did you learn from your mother or mother figure about being a girl or a woman? Or if you're a man, what did you learn about from your father or father figure about being a boy or a man? Or if you're gender non-binary, what'd you learn from your parental figures about your gender identity? And that question will open up worlds in that dinner conversation. It's like when we go to dinner with new people and they don't know anything about us and they say, what do you do for a living? And we say what we do, the whole evening is different because everyone is so thirsty for this conversation. And it's like, where do we get invited into it?
Oh, that's beautiful. Yes, they're thirsty, whether or not they know what they're thirsty for. But
Right.
but it is like how it's just not part of our normal framework. Like
No.
just like I think everybody before they graduate from high school should know what their parental complexes are, so they know like what's going to get in their way eventually at some point when they, how they think. It's so many things that we're behind, and it does remind me, though, that in times like now where there's so much dismantling, that your program is needed. I mean, that's why, you know what I mean? Because there's a gap, there's an emptiness, and nature doesn't like that, right? So whoever's there to fill in the gap, and it might be these rigid extremist ideas. That's why so many people it makes sense they're susceptible to it. You can't even really judge them for like being pulled that way, especially if there's nothing to compete or to encounter with. Like, come on over here. Come on over here. There's love over here. There's
Yeah.
love for you. And once you love yourself, you'll see things differently. And so, yeah, so I'm glad that you added that. So I think, lastly, we wove in reconciliation, but I like, I don't know. I feel like I want to talk about reconciliation a little bit more, and maybe, yeah, I'm just going to throw that to you. Talk more about reconciliation.
Well, I have a story for you
Oh,
again.
good.
This one is, we've changed her name to Dolores, and she came to a workshop. And when she first came, she was so excited to be there, but she didn't know anything about what it was going to be about. And she started sharing, but when she'd share a story in third person. And then throughout the workshop, which was, 3 or 4 days, she started opening up more. And it turned out the story she was sharing was her own story, but she and her children had made a pact to never share it about themselves because it was a family secret. And the story was that she lived with a very abusive husband, and he used to dangle the babies over the banister upstairs, threatening to drop them with Dolores below, ready to catch them. At one point, he moved his mistress into the house and made Dolores and the children sleep in the bathroom. And for years this went on. Eventually her husband died, and she was free. The children were free, and the mistress moved out. She came to the workshop, and throughout the workshop started sharing just a little bit more. And at the end of it, she just felt so free. It's like the chains were cut, they were broken, and she could live again and breathe again. About a week after.
But I just want to say one thing, if I can interject. One of the things that was so liberating for her was to have men truly hear and witness her and empathize with her. That she had never had before.
Yeah, and they actually sat and just listened. And that was so important for her healing. Thank you, Will. That was an important piece. Yeah. And so about a week after the workshop, we saw her, and she came running up to us and said, "Cynthia and Will, I've got to tell you, after the workshop, I went to my husband's grave, and I was able to forgive him for everything he had done." And then she said, "And then I knew where his mistress lived, and I hadn't seen her in over 30 years. And I went and I knocked on the door, and the mistress answered, and she said, 'Dolores, I've been thinking about you all week.'" Well, the workshop had been happening, right?
Right.
And she was in a wheelchair, and she invited Dolores in, and she said, "I know that I'm in this wheelchair for everything I did, all the horrific things I did to you and your children." They were able to talk, forgive, reconcile.
Oh my God.
And our team of facilitators did a skillful facilitation. We held the space, but it was really Dolores being able to share and having men, listen to her, that allowed some accountability and witnessing for all the pain she had gone through, that allowed her to come to a place of true forgiveness and a place of reconciliation in herself and with the 2 other people that
This,
had caused
this
this
is
ending.
perfect because what you say is so true. Like, it's one thing to find a supportive group of women. It's completely different to find that sort of support and understanding from men without a defensiveness, for them to
Yes.
just be like, wow, I feel your wound, and I'm not going to make it about me right now. I didn't do that. You know what I mean? Where
Yeah.
and also, I've always believed that we're not going to get anywhere unless we walk together. That, I mean, look,
That's
women just fighting alone, and there are lots of quality men. There's, that are
Mhm.
allies, right? But we will not be able to reconcile these perceived opposites. They're not real opposites, right? They're us
Right.
mirrored in the other. And so, until we can do that, the heaven and the earth, the reconciling, then something new. I like the androcentric, I like the androgynous, because really, oh, now hermaphrodites is and hermaphrodite is coming up, and that it is, androgynous doesn't mean no, it just it is like that transcended third, right? It's not
it
both.
is.
It is, yeah. I mean, it's even
It includes both and transcends both. And
right.
it's long been recognized as kind of the hallmark of really spiritually advanced people. I remember Teresa of Avila, the great mystic who reformed a whole order of men at a
Mm,
time when she was vulnerable to being killed by the Inquisition at any
mm,
moment. And it was said of her that men encountered in Teresa a woman who was more of a man than they were,
mm,
while also being fully a woman. Well, that was
mm.
simply because she had fully inhabited all the powers of the human being in one being. And that's
Yes,
what we're all called to do.
Mm.
And so this is really powerful because that is also the power of community to heal these intractable issues. And that speaking these truths across the gender divide can waken a mutual compassion that facilitates a profound transformation.
absolutely. And also, I think there are many people, especially my listeners, who are familiar with this inner masculine and feminine. So they get that now. Masculine and feminine is not tied to gender. It is in all of us. And it's not so much balance as fluidity. So there are times when masculine style of consciousness is called for, is needed over the feminine
Yeah.
style of consciousness. And then there are other times. So it is like, how do human beings build that capacity to be in relationship with both and to be able to call on them at the appropriate time? So I love it. Is there anything else you guys want to add, or maybe you want to describe, sort of give a sneak peek of like what's in the book? So whether it's topics or people who represent certain geographies or cultural groups, or just to get, why may they want to go check at the table of contents, and what might they find?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of stories, a lot of
Okay,
narratives, and all of them come to a happy ending
that's good.
and a reconciled kind of
Mm,
place. And they're throughout the stories. They're across cultures, the places that we've been working, our teams have been working. And they're just a deep dive in, and you can a deep dive and a lift up then.
mhm.
So and you can open the book and read one story and be transported. We've actually had people tell us that the book itself has been healing for them to
Ooh,
read in their
okay.
own lives. Yeah.
Yeah,
Stories will do that.
Yeah.
we've had people tell us that they get moved to tears by many of the stories because these are things that have actually happened,
Mm,
and they're so heart touching. And but just to give you a very brief map, probably the first third of the book goes into depth about how we work in groups and the kinds of experiences that we've witnessed in that collective alchemy, in that process of deep truth telling, witnessing one another's gendered experiences, pain, and all of it, and then moving through that to a place of reconciliation and mutual honoring and really harvesting the alchemical gold. And then we move into the application of this work in all these different arenas, in the LGBTQ community, in the BIPOC community, in political spheres, in government, at the UN. So we have
Oh.
different chapters that focus on the work that we've done in these different contexts. And then we have a whole section where we go into the work in different countries and cultures around the world. And then the last part of the book contains a whole research project that was done at 2 different universities in South Africa, a year-long research in which they had the students do our work twice over that year. And then they did follow-ups monthly. And the researchers concluded that this kind of work should be at the beginning of every university environment for all the students. That was such a great conclusion for us. And what they said was the students were able to excavate their own gendered experiences and free themselves from the shackles of a patriarchal civilization.
Oh my
That
gosh.
was really something. And it's true because we're working with something that is so universal. It's the power of truth and love.
Mhm.
And, you know, if the truth shall set you free, the deeper truths will set us more deeply free. And that's what we experience in this work. If we can create a place where we can go to that depth,
Yeah.
it's something we all need, but we all shy away from because we know there's going to be some pain involved.
Right. That vulnerable
gift,
part. Yep.
That's right. The gift is worth the pain. And one thing I wanted to say, by the way, about men being vulnerable, because you said something that women don't want men to be vulnerable. In our experience, at least in the context of our work, where people have come to do this work, men get very vulnerable and women love it.
We do.
Because
Yep.
men are moving into their authenticity.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they're revealing, hey, this form of being a man, I don't even want it.
Right.
No.
I never wanted it. I never had a choice. So I can say with conviction that in the men that come to our work over 30 years, 95% of them are eager for a whole new way of being a man, and they were never shown how. They want a whole new way of relating to sexuality, and they never had another model other
Right.
than the objectifying, you know, pornographic initiation, which isn't an initiation at all. It's a betrayal. And that's not a moralistic thing. I'm not anti-porn per se,
Right.
but it's not how sex works.
Right.
It's not just wham bam genital traffic.
Oh, there's
So much more than that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we don't even have time
it's
to go there, but
intimacy, it's vulnerability. Men want that.
yeah, they do
Men
want
a
do want
different relationship with women, and they don't know how to create it. And that's what happens in our work is they discover that.
Right. And I think like, well, of course, that's what you create space for. That's safe and it's a vessel for this to happen. And I think like not to be judgmental of the women who aren't able to see or handle the vulnerability of men. That's just a reflection of their own wounds. Right.
Well, and
So
it's also in a social context where they need the protection of men. But in order for men to show up fully in their humanity, they need a place where they can share their truth and their vulnerability and their brokenness with one another and with women. And when that happens, a new power of the real masculine comes forward. And what you said earlier is very true. Men are in crisis now, and men do need a kind of support that they're not getting. And that they haven't gotten with the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement was very important, and we laud it. And the Women's March on Washington. But I'm telling you, there is a masculinity revolution taking place, as well as a femininity revolution and an LGBTQ revolution. There is a gender revolution happening across every segment of humanity. And the masculinity revolution is it's the most lagging, but it's happening.
yeah.
Very important.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. Oh, that's a perfect way to end. I love it. And I want to talk with, this is what I was going to say. So it sounds like the book is able to be experienced on a multiple levels from individual sort of inspiration. You might open it up and go, oh, that word seems intriguing. I'm going to go there and I'll be inspired and may contribute. You may have a big cry, which is soul making, of course, when you're sobbing. And so you might be transformed by reading the book, but I'm also really intrigued by the fact that, that like a company or an organization or a city can benefit by reading the application part of the book. And then I really want to talk to whoever's writing about that university research and that needs to be. Oh, and I also want to do another podcast about men. I love men, and I have a particular place in my heart for men and for especially Gen Z men.
Right.
So
Maybe we
We
could,
can
well,
get
we
you
could-
some in our
and-
work if
and
you
maybe
want.
you could do a men's panel or something. That'd be fun.
oh my
Yeah.
gosh. Yeah, I love
Be
it.
happy
So
to help
more,
that. And
yeah.
we can put you in touch with the researcher who did the research on this.
Yeah,
We'd
sure.
love to do that.
oh, I've got a
That's
year,
great,
I've got a year
Deborah.
full of podcasts. I love it. So so thank you so much for taking time. It was a conversation full of depth and inspiration and yeah, and very forward looking. I'm
Mm.
excited.
Well,
You know-
that's really important because while the system does need to be changed,
Mhm.
we're not really out trying to change the system. What we're trying to do is create a new reality, a new civilization, a new world.
It's
Yeah.
so attractive that people lose interest in the old system.
Yeah.
Oh,
What we do in this work is we go through the dysfunction that we've all experienced, and then we begin the work of reinventing the gender and sexuality future of humanity. That is so exciting and inspiring.
And coming into the fullness of who we are. And I mean, the whole question that Ramana Maharshi said of who am I, reflect on that.
mhm.
That's many lifetimes of a question, right?
Yeah.
So let's begin. There is no time like the present. That's
Oh,
what
no.
I'm going to say. I mean, we're at a crisis level on so many levels, but to come into this kind of work or any kind of transformative work that brings joy, vitality, love, compassion, deeper respect, and higher reverence, why wouldn't we step into that? That's what's going to change this world.
And if nothing else, this book, if you read this book, it gives you hope,
Mhm.
fresh hope, because it's a positive message. And we have been so inspired by the power of the human spirit to transform these issues if we can just create the forums for it to take place. And that's what this book documents. And we've heard from many people who read the book, they say, I come away feeling so much hope in an area where I had so little.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you, Deborah.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Cynthia Brooks and William Keepin. And I hope you feel hopeful and inspired about the deeper meaning of the parallel movements of the climaxing hate and the dismantling of unjust systems that is happening right now. Something new definitely is being begged to be unleashed into the collective consciousness. Perhaps you've become inspired to turn inward, to explore your own wounded masculine or wounded feminine or both. Maybe you'll be inspired to work towards inner reconciliation, which then might manifest as a new version of you being unleashed into the world. Remember, our soul, our unconscious, speaks to us in many ways to get our attention and to prompt us to explore something deep inside. If you found yourself uncomfortable, triggered, or anxious at any point during our chat, there it is, an invitation to explore a part of you that's dying to come out and play. Until next time.